You have heard from Dr. Jones, you have heard from Dr. Johnson, and you have heard from Dr. Butterfield. I was lucky to get out of 4 years of college and shocked myself. Second reason I am amazed I'm here, a number of years ago, Bob Turner was teaching in the Bear Valley Institute, and he taught classes on how to speak. And one day I said, Bob, I have to speak next Sunday. Would you do me a favor? Would you sit up front and critique me as if I were your student? I had 3 pages of notes, and he had 6 pages worth of notes. So when Bill called and said, we'd like for you to come down, Bob said, I thought, you mean Bob Turner? But somehow along the way, Bob, we have been able to connect and improve, and Bob said some really nice things, which I appreciate. I've learned a lot from Bob along the way, too, and continue to do so. You've never heard of Jesse Mullins. He was a pretty normal guy, as the world would see. Not terribly exceptional. Never see him on the front cover of a magazine or in the newspaper. He grew up in a coal town, Jesse did. I remember hearing stories about him working 36-inch coal, where the coal vein was this high and they'd have to go in on cars on their backs to work. He joined the Army and was on Guam and Tinian during World War II as a mechanic in the motor pool. Came home after the war and was married. Worked for Sears for a long time as a service tech. Remember those old vans they had that were aqua colored? Ugliest things you've ever seen. Drove one of those for many years as a service tech. But what was interesting about Jesse Mullins was he was an elder for many years. And I remember when he passed away, our family, this is back in the day when everybody would come to your house and bring a covered dish for a funeral. Remember that? We were overwhelmed by the number of people and the wonderful comments that were made about my grandfather. I remember my father saying, you would have thought a rich man died. Who are all these people? And somebody said to me, and I don't remember who it was, but I've never forgotten the comment. My grandfather died of a heart attack, and someone said to me on that day, it's ironic that his heart would fail because that's what made him special. His heart. I thought a lot about him as I was thinking about this lesson. And it was years until I really understood what I learned from him and watching him lead with his heart. Those were great lessons. And frankly, the older I get, the better those lessons get. The title of this lesson accurately assumes a connection between heart and leading. You know, I love Paul too. As an elder, I think you have to really appreciate Paul and the struggles he went through in trying to get the church to understand what the right thing to do was. His writings, I think, are full of compassion, and his investment, personally, was unrivaled. I think you can hear it in his voice. Matter of fact, 2 Corinthians chapter 2. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might also know the love which I have so abundantly for you. You can hear the heart in his voice. You can hear the love in his voice. As he's saying to them, look, I had to write this epistle to you, this 1 Corinthians letter. And it killed me to do it. But I had to, because of the love I have for you. Paul led with his heart. As an elder, I know you appreciate it's sometimes difficult to influence people to do the right thing. And often it's people in the congregation that you lead that you struggle with. And sometimes those can be heart-rending situations because it doesn't always work. I think Paul's love for people was evident by that distress in his tone. But his love was motivated by an understanding that God loved him first. 1 John chapter 4. You know, Paul led with his heart, but that wasn't all he did. That led to action. And we look at the exploits of Paul, the journeys he took, the difficulties he was in. And we think, man, that guy turned his life upside down for the work. Why did he do that? It's a heart question. It's a heart question. Just a few chapters over, 2 Corinthians. You've read this, chapter 11. He goes through the cost that he incurred by turning his life upside down. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes, minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods, once stoned. 3 times I'm shipwrecked. A night and a day I've been in the deep. Journeys often, perils of water, peril. He goes on and on. You go down to verse 28, and this is what I find interesting. Up till this, it's all of these physical situations that have been taxing to him, difficulties. Verse 28, he says, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I'm not weak? Who's made to stumble? I don't burn with indignation. It wasn't just the physical difficulties that were the cost of his heart. It was also those things that really gnaw at us and concern us. I got a call one morning. It was early. It was in Denver. Got a call from my vice president running the West Coast, the company I was working for at the time. He says, boss, we got a problem. A young man this morning on the way to work was in a one-car accident, and he died. He was 25 years old, very well liked out of the whole team in Livermore, California, where the office was. He said, we're trying to figure out what to do about that. He said, it's even more complicated than that. He said, it just so happens he's on sort of the last road before you get to the office. So the entire organization drove by his car this morning on the way, and it was ugly. He was hanging half out of the truck. He said, I've got a shell-shocked group. There's 35 men, and they're at loose ends this morning. What are we going to do? So we had a meeting with senior team. We got on the phone. We had a conversation. We hired some grief counselors. We gave everybody the day off. About an hour after the occurrence, this young man's parents came in. They were Spanish-speaking only. They had no idea what to do. They were at loose ends. They didn't know what to do. And the only place they knew that people might help them was where he worked. So we had a superintendent actually took them to the morgue to identify the body. And we found out that this young man was the major provider for this family. So all the guys took up a collection, and they gathered about $10,000 that helped with his funeral and that sort of thing. And as we had our conversation that morning, we said, look, we don't really have a policy for this, but we should do something. It was a pretty large company at the time, and I remember my HR director said, well, we got to be careful we don't create some sort of precedent here. I said, what are you talking about? How many people are we going to get killed in a car accident in the mornings? Precedent? We should do something about this. We wrote the family a check for $20,000. That was nothing because of the loss of their son. And frankly, it wasn't in our manual. There was no precedent in our experience for how to handle that. but we did it. And here's why. We don't lead organizations. We don't lead programs. We lead people. At the end of the day, we can't forget that is the central focus of our efforts. We lead people. See, why is that important? Look, in the case of spiritual leaders, guys, it's eternally important. It matters. Souls are at stake relative to the decisions we make, the conversations we have, the encouragement we give or withhold. You say, well, how do we do that? This is a buzzword, buzz phrase you've heard. We have to meet people where they are. But the more I've thought about that phrase, the more it resonates with me, and the more important that phrase is. To meet people where they are. I think about Jesus in John chapter 4 as he sat next to the well with the Samaritan woman. Jesus knew the history. He knew the history of the Jews and the Samaritans. She was shocked he even spoke to her. And he goes through this conversation with her, and she slowly begins to get it. And he started by asking her a question that he already knew the answer for. But he knew what sort of response he would get. See, he knew where she was. You know, I think about Philip and the eunuch. Philip runs alongside the eunuch. He says, hey, you know what you're reading? Nope. How would I know? No one around to tell me. So he hops up with him, and he reads from Isaiah. I'm convinced he could have been reading from Genesis chapter 1. It wouldn't have mattered. He taught him Jesus from where he was. Philip understood to meet him where he was. Look, there's a person staring down cancer, being laid off from a job, fighting a continuing addiction, managing aging parents, retiring without enough money, dealing with the loss of a child. I don't know, but they're in your congregation. These things are real. And these things impact the spiritual health of the members of the congregation. I'll be frank with you, I don't know how Terry did what he did today. If that's happening with my daughter, I'd tell y'all bye. I'd be gone. I was really thankful he decided to stay long enough to have the conversation with us. See, dealing with these things requires that a leader leads from the heart. Because at the end of the day, we have to help them see Jesus. That's our job. Despite the difficulties, despite the challenges. I had one of the other elders at Bear Valley come to me one morning on a Sunday morning, and he said, hey, you need to come meet this guy. There's a guy I think we need to help. As I walked to see this guy, I looked and said, uh-oh, this is a little different. He's a street guy. He's living off the street. You could smell him from 10 feet away. He was a mess. His name was Jeremy. Jeremy was an interesting guy in that I expected certain things. I had an anticipation, A, he was going to ask for money. All I'm thinking as I'm walking up is, this guy's going to ask for money. That's why he's here. How many of you elders deal with people that need money? Happens a lot. So I'm a little it's a little predetermination in my head, right? He's going to ask for money. You know what's interesting? Jeremy never asked for anything. Nothing. For 6 months, he was there every Sunday morning. We would sometimes sort of force something on him and say, Jerry, look, can you take a little, I remember taking money out of my pocket and saying, look, here's $50, Jeremy. I mean, maybe that'll help you. Okay. Yeah. Do you have enough food? Let's go down to the pantry and get you some food. It's a little chilly. Why don't we grab you another coat? Okay. And then one day, Jeremy walked in with his 8-year-old son. Didn't see that coming. As it turns out, his ex-wife finally figured that Jeremy had gotten himself together enough that he could have a day spent with his son. And where did he bring him? He brought him to church. I learned a lot of lessons with Jeremy. After about 6 or 7 months, Jeremy disappeared. I don't know what happened to Jeremy. It was impossible to get a hold of the guy. He didn't have an address, didn't have a phone, he didn't have anything. He didn't want to be held accountable to anything. I hope, and I have an optimism in me that says, Jeremy got better, and his trajectory increased along the way. Maybe he went somewhere and got some more help along the way. I don't know that. But I learned a handful of things from him. When we think about how we lead from the heart, don't have preconceptions. The one thing I think Jeremy ever asked was, if I come to class first, can I sleep in one of the chairs in the lobby for a few minutes, just sitting there, because I'm afraid to sleep at night because somebody's going to do something to me. That was his big ask. Yeah, you can do that. That'd be fine, Jeremy. Listen and observe. The more we talked to Jeremy, the more we sort of understood where he was, and we figured out ways we could sort of help him by having those conversations, but more than anything, us just listening and not saying much. And the third thing I learned from him was, it's different with everybody, but we have to create space for people to see Jesus sometimes. And it's different with a guy that lives under a bridge. That's a whole different level of challenge. But I think he saw him. And I know that in his life, something changed for the positive along the way. I learned a lot from Jeremy. So the title of this lesson assumes another thing as well. And by the way, I love the title of this lesson. When the elder sent this to me, I said, you got to be kidding me. This is perfect. I'm an old contractor. When I saw the word constructing, I was like, this is fantastic. The next thing I think that it assumes is that the heart of a spiritual leader must be built. And really the question is, how do we do that? How do we build the heart of a spiritual leader? Constructing a spiritual leader's heart implies intent, implies commitment. And I love, someone brought up earlier, Nehemiah. I love the story of Nehemiah. You can actually see the construction of a spiritual leader's heart if you read the story of Nehemiah. The wall is secondary. He was first convicted in his heart. If you look at chapter 1, verse 4 of Nehemiah, you look at chapter 2, verses 2, there's some discussion there where the king said, first he says, when I heard the news about what was going on in Jerusalem, it hurt his heart. He wept for days. And then when the king sees him later on, when he goes, you remember he goes to the king, and the king says, what's the matter with you? You're not sick. You're heart sick. That's his observation. So we can see that Nehemiah began by leading from the heart. Chapter 2, he starts to figure this thing out. And he realizes, I got to figure out the resource side, and I got to figure out the politics. And he talks to the king, he says, look, I'm going to need lumber, I'm going to need materials. Can you help me? Yep. And by the way, I'm not sure if those folks are going to let me pass through. They're not going to love this idea. Can you help me get through that? Yeah. And then later on in chapter 2, he actually arrives and he begins to survey the project. He rides out with a couple of men and he actually surveys the project to see just how bad things are. In chapter 3, puts a plan together. As most plans go, it worked perfectly. Are you saying that's not true? Of course it didn't go as planned. I just think about the inherent difficulties of what he was doing. Look, from an old contractor, I'm just telling you, when I read the verse that says, and the perfumers were assigned to build a section of wall, I think, oh man, this is going to be a challenge. No craftsman. But here's what happens. Difficulty, flexibility, and commitment are going to test the heart of a leader. In chapter 4, things really ramp up. In chapter 4, the enemies show themselves and begin to make a plan to attack. That's a difficulty. And Nehemiah has to figure something out. He's going to make some changes quick. So he's flexible, and he makes changes. And before long, he has armed men standing at certain places. He has people with, carrying materials in one hand and a sword in the other hand. And throughout all of this, he completes the project. See, these three things are really important when you're building the heart of a spiritual leader. Difficulty builds patience to wait on God. I am the most impatient person I know. It makes me crazy. I know it makes my wife crazy. She's told me. When you're trying to build something and you have in your head that it's going to go this way and we're going to do this and this is the time frame and it doesn't happen, it makes me crazy. Difficulty causes us to wait on God. And flexibility reflects our confidence in God instead of my way. Because that's really what a lot of this comes down to. Well, this is the way I think we should do it. God might not agree. And lastly, commitment is the result of an expectation in God to deliver. When COVID started, how many of you had a great plan and were really comfortable with it? The Bear Valley building sits in the city and county of Denver, which is about as liberal as Seattle. And the policies mirror that. For a while, we had elders meetings twice a week because the plan would change so that from Monday to the next Sunday, we had to change it at least twice as the rules continued to change. And I'll be honest with you, I had no idea how we were going to get through it. We didn't even understand the problem, let alone the solutions. But somehow we all got through it. We're all here. I'd shared some stories with a couple of guys about how many people maybe disappeared through that process and some of the ongoing challenges that we're all having on the backside of that round and whatever round we're in now, I don't even know. But at the end of the day, we got through it. I had a project in Texas one time. We were building several bridges for the Department of Transportation. We had a project that was way behind schedule, running over budget. I went out to look at the job, and this is what I found. This was day one. That's a $500,000 piece of equipment up to the motor in the water. You can notice that's a brand new piece of equipment, by the way. Probably had 50 hours on it. What had happened was we had this plan to build these bridges, and we were going to do it when it wasn't quite as wet, supposedly. And guess what? It got wet. So not only did we lose a piece of equipment for a few days and have to get it hauled out with a crane, the guy running the project on this big curved bridge had built the low side first, so the upside held water. We had pumps running all the time trying to get the water off the bridge. Had concrete at one point. Cost me $325,000 worth of concrete. Had to sue them. We had to jackhammer half the bridge out because concrete was bad. By the way, the bid was upside down. Somebody bid it wrong, missed it by 10%. We were hoping to make 7% on the job. Simple math. Bad number. And the poor guy running the project was 62 years old, and he'd about had it. And he said, "Boss, I quit." And I said, "Johnny, you can't quit. Like, you can't quit. I'll drag you out here. Because we got to finish this bridge." We had difficulty. We had to have some flexibility. And ultimately, we still got the project done. We did lose money. Didn't fix that part. Look, there's a lot of pressure. And things don't always go the way we think. You don't have to raise your hand, but let me ask you a question. In the last 2 years, have any of you considered resigning? Serious question. I'm going to guess a bunch. There is pressure and there's difficulty when you're building the heart of a spiritual leader. And make no mistake, we will be pressed, hearts will be tested. But if we're going to survive and thrive through those challenges, we have to build our hearts. I love chapter 4, Nehemiah. Listen how Nehemiah has grown. Verse 13 and 14. "So I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings. I set the people according to their families with their swords, their spears, their bows." Now listen. "And I looked and arose and I said to the leaders and the rest of the people, 'Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses.'" That's a motivational speech by a growing leader. Heart building is intentional, and it requires commitment. Constructing the heart of a leader is also a process. There's an order to construction. Ignoring the process can be devastating. This is just a little bit of something I wanted you to see. For everything that happens in construction, there is a very specific process. This is just sort of a glossary of all the processes on this project. And there's really not much more important than a foundation. A number of years ago, we built synthetic ball fields all over the United States, and I had 2 projects. And the superintendent did not read the geotechnical report correctly, and he didn't stabilize the soil correctly. This was 5A football, boys. And about football season, it looked like the dunes. That's a problem. We had to pull those fields up, restabilize the soil, put it all back down again, because we didn't follow the process. Foundation building is critical. It's influenced by geography, by soil type, location, type of structure, et cetera, et cetera. It's complicated and it can be challenging. The foundation has 2 real purposes. The first is to support a vertical downforce. That's a picture of the Millennium Towers in San Francisco. I've stood right about where that picture is being taken, although I didn't take that picture. 645 feet tall. It's one of the top 10 largest buildings in the city of San Francisco. Last I checked, and they keep it current, the last I checked the other day, it's sunk 18 inches and it's leaning 14. How'd you like to own part of that? It's not handling the downforce. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, there are a handful of words in that verse. Elders, this will make the hair on the back of your neck come up. The verse is really talking about the responsibility of the congregation to the elders, but listen to these words here. For those who must give account. That is the vertical pressure. And building a solid foundation as we're building our hearts is critical to support that downforce. The second thing a foundation does is restrict horizontal movement. That's a picture of Hoover Dam. You ever been in Hoover Dam? I drove my family crazy. I bought the most expensive tour you can buy at Hoover Dam. I wanted to see it all. By the end of that, they were rolling their eyes. It's concrete. Like, I know, isn't it fascinating? We went all the way to the bottom of Hoover Dam, and I found it really interesting as you get in the bottom. You know there's cracks in Hoover Dam? Do you know they have earthquakes there? They've had several earthquakes there. And what's interesting is it cracks Hoover Dam. And they mark the cracks and the years, and then they go back and look at those things every year to see if there's any of this. Right? See if there's any horizontal movement in the dam. It's huge. It's 660 feet thick. It's quite a structure. You don't want that to move. In 2 Peter chapter 2, first few verses. And there will also be false prophets among you. That's that horizontal movement. So a good foundation as we build our hearts can support the pressure, and it can eliminate the slide of going either way from where it's intended to be. There's a couple ways we can do that. Number one, establishing an intimate, vibrant, growing relationship with God is foundational. I love the story of Joshua. Chapter 17 of Exodus. We begin to see Joshua being built, the heart of a spiritual leader being built. And I find it interesting, his first deployment, as he has to go fight, he comes back, and God says to Moses, look, I want to tell you something about these people you just defeated. Get Joshua, I want him to hear this. Isn't that interesting? He wants Joshua to understand what he wants. And as we think about this relationship we have with God, we need to know what God wants. Secondly, a little bit further on, Exodus chapter 33, we have to recognize the importance of communication with God. I love that phrase. This is like, I think to myself, wouldn't this be the best relationship ever? And God spoke to Moses face to face as he was speaking to a friend. I haven't gotten there yet. But wouldn't you love to? Wouldn't you love to have that kind of relationship when you talk to him and feel that close to him? And interestingly enough, when Moses would go out and talk to God, who went with him? Joshua. And when Moses went back, Joshua would stay and have his own conversation, I assume. We have to understand what God wants. We have to recognize the importance of communicating with God. And third, we have to maintain an enthusiasm for God's work. Numbers chapter 13 and 14, it all comes to a head. Joshua and Caleb, the other 10 men, have gone in, they've come back. 10 men say, can't do it. 2 men say, yes, we can. And Joshua and Caleb are animated. They're trying to convince these bullheaded people, God can take care of this. We can do it. Despite the difficulty. He understands now sort of the idea of minority action, doesn't he? 2 against many. Look, leaders, if our hearts are not built on a foundation of God's principles, his expectations, his limits, and his goals, then I would tell you, stop the project. Leaders constructed otherwise are ineffective. The foundation matters. Another way we construct our hearts in the process of doing so is to share time together with God. I had a concrete finisher work for me for years. His name was Bill. He's the best concrete finisher I've ever seen in my life. I don't know if you know much about concrete, but it's basically a 3-step process. Go fast, wait, go fast again. And 4 hours later, it's over whether you want it to be or not. So the part in the middle is always the hard part, where you wait. Because if you wait a little bit too long, then it's a mess. And if you don't wait long enough, well, then it's a mess. And I remember watching Bill lay under a tree, and he didn't want to get up. So he took a little pebble, And he'd toss it in the air, and he'd let it hit the concrete, and he'd say, about 10 more minutes. I think, how does he know that? I have no idea how he knows that. And he was always right. There is no substitute for experience. And our experience, our time we spend with God, there is certainly no substitute for. His experience develops a high degree of self-awareness. I think about Joshua again. He's gone up in the mountain with Moses. He's come back down in Exodus chapter 32, and he hears something. And think about, who's Joshua? What's his job? He's the fighter. So what does he think he hears? Moses, it's the sound of battle. What's the sound of battle? It was way worse. It was the sound of Israel who had been worshiping a golden calf. That's what he heard. And he learns very quickly, oh, maybe I was incorrect in my assumption. And maybe there's something worse than the sound of battle. Experience also gives us a reason for being optimistic about tomorrow. And when Joshua in chapter 14 Numbers, when he says, look, we can do this, this isn't, oh yeah, I suddenly decided I think God's going to be able to pull it off. This is a summary of this time, these numbers of years Joshua has spent with Moses and spent with God, and he's seen what God has done. So when he reaches this point where the rubber meets the road and they're going to go in or they're not going to go in, Joshua says, yeah, we can. Yeah, we can. Because of his experience, he was optimistic. In Joshua chapter 24, it's almost the end of his life. Joshua is about to be done, and he has this deep confidence in God. And he says to the people, look, you can do whatever you want. You can follow those gods, you can do this, but I'm telling you right now what I'm going to do. I'm following Yahweh. That's what I'm going to do. And my whole family. That's a similar. That's a culmination of the experience that he has had with God and the confidence gained by that. Last thing. Constructed hearts must be maintained. Must be maintained. That's the Golden Gate Bridge. You ever been over that bridge? Big bridge, built in 1937. Some of the cables on that bridge, they're pressed, twisted cable, and they're 36 inches around. Imagine a single cable, 36 inches around. It's quite a structure. If you were to weigh all the materials on that bridge, it's 840 million pounds. Something you may not know. It costs $65+ million a year to maintain that bridge. Just to maintain the bridge. See, there is a real impact to ignoring maintenance. There's an average of 120, this is disconcerting by the way, I'll warn you before. There's an average of 128 bridges a year that collapse in the United States. I did not build this one, just to be clear. 128 bridges. And interestingly enough, there are enough bridges that collapse in the United States every year that there's a group called Bauman Headland. They're bridge collapse attorneys based in California. That's what they do, is litigate bridge collapses. How comfortable does that make you? By the way, Ron and I saw a bridge inspector this morning on the 414 bridge as we came under it. I'm not sure what that means. Just thought I'd let you know. Here's the thing. Exposure to outside influences can erode the structural integrity of a leader's heart. So what are you exposing yourself to, intentionally or unintentionally? Who do you spend time with? Who do you have conversations with? What do you do when you have free time? Where do you go? What do you watch? What do you listen to? Ever ask yourself those questions? You see, all of that impacts your heart. And the wrong things can cause a problem. There are some ways to maintain your heart. Just give you a couple of things. Number one, protect your heart through prayer. Protect your heart through prayer. The time talking to God is imperative, we talked about. But think about the way you pray. We need to have the right motives. We need to be aligned with God's motives. You need not to be self-seeking. It's in John chapter 5. We need to be consistent with what God wants. And we need to be confident they're going to be answered. I was telling Bill this story last night at his place. When we selected a minister, which, by the way, we hired in January of 2020, he preached all of 6 times before COVID hit, and we went remote. Welcome. We were in the process of trying to identify someone. We had literally almost 100 applications, and all this was going on. And I had a couple of the members at some point would come up to me and they said, "Man, I really feel for you. I know it's really stressful going through this." And I said, "It's not stressful." I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Look, here's the deal. I know I'm not qualified to make the best decision here. But God's going to figure it out. And I can't write it down for you. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But I know that by the end of the process, we'll have the best man for our job here. And I'm not worried about it." That protects your heart to have those conversations with God and be confident He'll answer. The last way to do that is to renew your purpose. We need to know where God wants His people to be. And we need to think about what our role is in getting them there. We need to help the membership wherever we are elders develop their own hearts. Look, we have a challenge. Actually, I think it's a responsibility as spiritual leaders in God's church to intentionally build our hearts. Spiritual leaders, you are a work in process, just like Joshua. There's no arrival in this process. As long as we live and as long as we lead, we'll be a work in process. Our hearts are continually being constructed. Not only that, but I would tell you, I think that our responsibility is to grow the next set of spiritual leaders for God's church. It's not just a church issue. That's a leadership issue, to grow the next set of leaders. So spiritual leaders, lead from your hearts. Spiritual leaders construct your heart using time, intention, and commitment. Spiritual leaders understand that this is a lifelong process that you're engaged in. Spiritual leaders maintain your heart. Let's close with a prayer. Father, we're grateful for today. We're thankful for you, for the purpose you give us. We appreciate the responsibility you have given us. Father, we're thankful for the relationships we share, not only with you, but with one another. And we ask that you would help us to deepen, broaden those relationships today, tomorrow, and the coming days. Father, we ask that as we leave this day together, we would be maybe more motivated than we were when we got here to do the right things for the right reason for you. Through Christ we ask this. Amen.